Hi everyone and welcome back to my art and crime series here on my channel. This is Fiona and this channel is called Drawings in a Drawer. This is the fourth episode of the art and crime series and I'm sorry this has been a long time coming, but it takes so long to research these cases. I've now decided I'm going to cover 10 Italian crimes and then I will basically decide whether to continue based on your demand, let's say. Otherwise I will just continue with my other regular art stuff. So today we are going to discuss the case of Yara Gambirasio. This case turned out to be the most expensive manhunt in Italian criminal history, and you'll soon see why. But of course the most important and dreadful thing here is that Yara, a young girl of only 13, tragically lost her life. And there's still no answers as to exactly why this happened, though as we've seen in the past with so many other cases, there very often isn't an answer other than perversion, evilness and very sick minds. Yara was a 13-year-old girl coming from a family of 6 with her parents Fulvio, an architect, and Maura, a teacher, and she had an older sister and 2 younger brothers. Their family led a very normal life, living in the small town of Brembate di Sopra, in the foothill of the Alps in the province of Bergamo in Lombardy in northern Italy. This is a small town which currently has just under 8,000 inhabitants. She went missing and most likely was killed on Friday the 26th of November 2010. So just 10 days ago, it was the 10th anniversary of Yara's death. Yara had a great passion in her life, and that was rhythmic gymnastics. She loved it. Her whole life revolved around it. And at the time when she went missing, she was actually preparing for a gymnastics display the following Sunday. The gym she attended was only a few hundred meters from her home, so she could easily make the walk alone. That day, in fact, she had only to drop off a stereo with her instructor and return straight home. She left her house at 5:15 p.m. Yara did not return home immediately, but I suppose it would have been normal for her to hang around the sports centre for a while, chatting with her friends and her instructor, and then walk back home within an hour or so. But by 7 p.m, she still hadn't returned, so her mother Maura decided to call her on her mobile phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Her parents began to get frantic. It was dark and cold outside, and no one knew what had happened to their 13-year-old daughter, who was usually always so reliable. So 20 minutes later, her father Fulvio called the police to report Yara missing. This case was immediately taken very seriously, with both the state police and the army police, the Carabinieri, getting involved. But what I think was really a key figure in resolving this case was that of Magistrate Letizia Ruggeri, who was put in charge of Yara's case. Letizia Ruggeri had worked in the police force for 20 years. She was one tough woman who knew what she was doing, and also, as a mother herself, she felt a connection with Yara's family's ordeal and immediately stepped into action. Everyone who knew Yara was interviewed. Her instructor confirmed the timeline, so Yara had done exactly what she told her parents she was setting out to do. She had briefly stopped at the gym to do some light exercises, dropped off the stereo and left. Her family was immediately put under the magnifying glass, and that is simply because that's what always happens in police investigations. In so many cases, the killer or the abductor is someone closer to the victim than we'd like to think, and the police know that. Even her parents' cold and composed behaviour after the disappearance of their daughter was cause for speculation at one point. I think it's worth mentioning here that the people of this area are usually very reserved. There's this cliché about your average Italian being loud and prone to big displays of emotion. Well, that is absolutely not always the case and also can vary a lot from region to region and quite simply from individual to individual. The police used bugs and wires to listen to everything that was going on, and it soon became pretty clear that the Gambirasios had absolutely nothing to do with Yara's disappearance. However, Magistrate Letizia Ruggeri didn't only have the Gambirasios' phones tapped. She had every potential suspect's phones tapped. Locals, people who lived and worked around the area where Yara lived, friends and friends of the family. Brembate di Sopra was a small community and it wasn't too hard to make a map of Yara's contacts or of the people she might have crossed in her everyday comings and goings. Even Yara's personal phone records were looked into, of course, and they showed that she had last used her mobile at 6:44 p.m. to text her friend Martina. In the text, she agreed to meeting up with her at 8 a.m. the following Sunday to attend the gymnastics display I mentioned earlier. So Yara was making plans. Yara was going about her 13-year-old girl's life as normal. It was quite obvious she hadn't done anything like run away or go into hiding in an act of rebellion or anything along those lines. Someone had taken her. So at 6:44, Yara texts her friend. But just after 7 p.m, and exactly at 11 minutes past 7, as you will remember, her mother calls her, and her phone goes straight to voicemail. So something had to have happened to her in that time span in just under 30 minutes. So the last signal from Yara's phone came from another town, a very small town called Mapello, which is about 3 kilometres away from Brembate di Sopra, and is in the opposite direction to Yara's house. This had been registered at 6:49 p.m. Shortly after that, the phone had stopped emitting a signal. Tracker dogs were brought in, and 3 of them led straight to Mapello. 2 weeks later, the police got their first lead. It came from one of the hundreds of phones they had wired, that of a Moroccan builder called Mohamed Fikri, who happened to work at a construction site in the town of Mapello. In one of the wiretapped conversations, which had been in Arabic, as of course Fikri's mother tongue was not Italian, the interpreter heard the phrase, "God save me, I have not killed her." By the time the police heard this, though, Fikri was on a boat bound for Tangiers, something which made him look even more guilty. On the 4th of December, Italian police intercepted the boat and arrested Mohamed Fikri, taking him back to Italy. They searched his van and found a blood-stained mattress in the back. Immediately, the media took this information and ran with it. The foreigner, the immigrant, killing the young girl. We see this happen very often in cases. But Fikri was completely innocent. Not only was the blood not Yara's, apparently it was his own blood, but the interpreter had mistranslated what he'd said in the phone call. I'm not quite sure how this serious mistake might have happened. Maybe it was a slightly different dialect or context, I don't know. But Fikri was innocent. People were still furious when Letizia Ruggeri released Fikri. They were still convinced he'd done it, that he was the bad guy. But truth was, the investigation was now at a dead end. Then, 3 months to the day after Yara's disappearance on February the 26th, 2011, it was a Saturday, and a man called Ilario Scotti was flying his remote-controlled plane in a field in an isolated area called Chignolo d'Isola. Suddenly, though, his model plane crashed to the ground, and when Scotti goes to retrieve it, he notices a bundle which he initially mistakes for a heap of rubbish, of rags left there in the shrubs. But then he notices a pair of shoes are attached to this bundle, and he suddenly realises he's looking at the body of a young girl lying face down in the earth. He calls the police and starts to walk away, but when he turns back, he notices he can't see the body anymore among the tall grass, so he returns to the spot to be able to point the police to the right location as soon as they get there. Magistrate Ruggeri received a call while she was returning from a day on the skiing slopes with her daughter. She was immediately advised of the discovery, so she left her daughter at home and went to the crime scene. Though the body was badly decomposed because it had been raining, snowing, the snow had melted, and then there had been more snowfall. Basically, the body had been freezing and unfreezing several times over the past 3 months. Still, Letizia Ruggeri felt her heart sink when she saw the black bomber jacket with the elasticated waist Yara had been wearing when she went missing. She was also wearing black leggings and a Hello Kitty sweatshirt. This was undoubtedly Yara. Her house keys, iPod and SIM card of her phone were also found next to her. The phone itself has never been recovered. When the autopsy was carried out, it showed that Yara had been injured several times with a sharp object across her lower back, wrists and neck. She also had wounds on her face and quite a serious injury on the back of her head. However, none of these wounds killed her. What killed her was hypothermia because of exposure. Yara had literally been dumped there and left to die alone in the cold. She had not been sexually assaulted, but her bra had been unhooked, which suggests that there may have been a sexual motive, and that maybe Yara, being a strong gymnast, had managed to fight back hard enough to stop the assault from happening, or maybe her killer had run off because he had been interrupted somehow. The investigators are positive Yara died in that field, probably during the night, because she was clutching a strand of grass from that very field, so the body was definitely not moved. They also found traces of lime on the body, and this led the police to believe that whoever had assassinated Yara was either a builder, a construction worker, or worked near building sites. Also, thanks to the recovery of poor Yara's body, they also had another clue. A tiny fragment of DNA was found on her underwear. So this led to the investigators coming up with ignoto uno, which just means unknown male number one, meaning that, of course, they had no idea who the DNA belonged to other than it was not Yara's own DNA. There were a couple of things that they could already tell from this fragment of DNA, and that was that this individual was a male, of course. He had a 95% chance of having extremely light eyes, like very light blue or green eyes, and that he was genetically linked to the area. So he was a local. Someone who possibly people in town run into every day, someone who was a friend of a friend, someone you might have had a chat with over an espresso, possibly even about Yara's case. This was huge, a huge piece of information. Magistrate Letizia Ruggeri started the biggest manhunt ever seen in Italy through DNA testing. Everyone got tested. Yara's family, her friends, her classmates, friends of the family, people who worked at the gym, all their relatives, and basically relatives of relatives. They simply wanted to cover as many people they could living in these communities in the foothills of the Alps. The police aimed at sampling around 15 to 20,000 people, and they knew that through familial genetics they would basically have a good chance of finding links to a much vaster slice of the population, living not only in these small towns, Brembate di Sopra and Mapello, but also the vaster surrounding areas. At this point in the investigation, police started to focus on the Y chromosome, which is found only in males and passed on through the paternal bloodline, and it basically remains unchanged for generations and generations. And it also means that through the original sample you can track down distant relatives, or rather, in this case, the police could. Not far from where Yara's body had been recovered was a nightclub called Sabbie Mobili, which means quicksands in Italian. And police were able to track down every man who had been there on the nights around Yara's disappearance through the club's membership cards. And this is where they got their first big break in October 2011. A man called Damiano Guerinoni, his DNA was very similar to that of Ignoto Uno, unknown male number one. But he was immediately cleared as a suspect because, 1, he wasn't a complete match, and 2, he had been travelling abroad at the time of Yara's murder. However, geneticists were convinced he was a relative of the killer, that he was the first link of a chain that would lead them straight to Yara Gambirasio's murderer. They had no idea how close of a relative he was. It might be a cousin or a distant uncle. But somewhere along that chain was the monster who had cut Yara's life short. They soon made another astonishing discovery. Guerinoni's mother, Aurora Zanni, had been the Gambirasio's housemaid throughout Yara's childhood, going to their home to help with chores twice a week. Aurora Zanni was shocked by this, and she had been very close to the family. She was still very fond of them. So the phones of the second family were again wiretapped, and also the police followed them, and they listened into their conversations. They were called up for DNA testing. But by that summer, the police just had to admit it was only a weird coincidence and that they had nothing to do with this terrible crime. However, fact remained, Damiano Guerinoni's DNA was still very similar to that of Ignoto numero uno, the killer. That fact didn't change. So Letizia Ruggeri and the police put a huge effort into recreating the Guerinoni's family tree, going back generations, connecting links. And by doing this, they discovered that most of the Guerinoni family originated from a small town called Gorno, about 45 kilometres away. This was a town of about 1,500 inhabitants, and according to one source, the people of this town were very, let's say, known for being active in amorous affairs. The police started testing everyone here whose surname was Guerinoni, and that was a lot of people. And they came across a DNA sample which was even a closer match to Ignoto number 1 than that of Damiano Guerinoni. It was Pierpaolo Guerinoni, Damiano's cousin. He was a 50% match to Ignoto number 1, and geneticists said this must be the brother of the killer. But Pierpaolo only had one brother, apparently, someone who was suffering with drug addiction and who turned out not to be a full match either. So the decision was made to look into Pierpaolo's father, Giuseppe Guerinoni. But DNA apart, Giuseppe could simply not be a suspect because he was no longer alive. He had passed away in 1999. Still, police needed his DNA very much to take that further, possibly final step. They asked the family to provide them with any personal items, any object that might still carry Giuseppe Guerinoni's DNA. And the family handed over a postcard he had sent them and a driving licence with a stamp on it. And back in those days, the stamp had to be licked and applied to the driving licence itself. Experts managed to extract the DNA from these items, and it was the same, meaning that basically they were certain it was Giuseppe Guerinoni's DNA and not someone else's. And also, they were able to see how similar it was to that of Ignoto number 1. So similar that they knew for a fact that Giuseppe Guerinoni was the father of Yara's killer. Never until now had the investigators felt they were so close to finally catching who had done this, who had hunted down a 13-year-old girl on her way home from the gym, attacked her and then left her there, abandoned her to die of cold, literally, in an overgrown field alone on a dark November night. On March the 7th, 2013, they took the further step of exhuming Giuseppe Guerinoni's body, and this only gave them further confirmation that this was the killer's biological father. It was clear that Giuseppe Guerinoni had been a man with a lot of secrets. This came as a shock to his family. Not so much because of this, let's say, double life he had probably led, but because somewhere out there they had a half-brother who had brutally murdered a young girl, a man who the media had been talking about for over 2 years, who the police had been hunting with everything they had since 2010. So in spite of this massive breakthrough, the investigators were basically at another dead end. It was clear that Giuseppe Guerinoni had at one point had a mistress or a one-night stand, and that he had an illegitimate son somewhere. But how were they going to go about tracking down this person when his very birth was a mystery, a secret that Guerinoni had taken to his grave and which would never have been uncovered if Yara's murder hadn't happened? So the police started looking into Giuseppe Guerinoni's life, searching for clues. Of course, his wife hadn't known anything about any affair, but Guerinoni had been the local bus driver, picking up women who worked in the textile factories in the area and dropping them off at their workplaces every day. And though it was hard to gather any more private information about it due to the fact that the local people were being very reserved about this, it was soon revealed that he had been quite the ladies' man and had probably had more than 1 or 2 extramarital affairs. Investigators started taking DNA samples from middle-aged to elderly women, someone who might have given birth to Guerinoni's baby boy 30 or 40 years ago. This left everyone baffled. Why were they taking DNA samples from 60, 70-year-old women in connection to the murder of a 13-year-old girl? By the end of 2013, so 3 years after Yara's death, the investigation was starting to turn cold. No DNA samples proved to be significantly linked to that of Ignoto number 1. After all, the woman who had Guerinoni's child might have died herself or moved away to a distant area, and if she was alive, she was quite clearly determined not to let one word slip about her dreadful secret. Still, Letizia Ruggeri wasn't about to give up. Throughout the investigation, she had been dragged through the mud. She had been accused very often by men colleagues, let's say, saying she didn't have the skills, that she basically was useless, and that she had wasted enough time and resources on this case without being any closer to finding the killer, and that she should basically resign. Letizia Ruggeri did the only thing left she could think of doing. She turned to 2 DNA experts at the University of Pavia. They again analysed Ignoto number 1's DNA, and they were able to find a rare genetic mutation that they called allele 26. But what was more important was that when they checked it against Guerinoni's DNA, they found that he did not have this mutation. So it could only have been passed down through the maternal bloodline. It was definitely a trait of the killer's mother's DNA. They finally had something that would help them narrow down their research vastly. So they had a pool of about 500 women who they thought probably were in the right age group and had moved around the area where Guerinoni had lived and worked at the same time. And of course, they would have to be women who had male children. These were surely all traits they used to identify this last group of people, of females. They went through these DNA samples one by one, and finally they got what they were looking for. It was the DNA sample 321. The woman's name was Esther Arzuffi, and she had this allele 26 mutation. They checked her DNA against that of Ignoto number 1, and it was a match. This was the killer's mother. Esther had 3 children. She had twins, a male and female, and another son. The twins had been born in 1970, and this made the male twin very likely to be Yara's killer. Let's say he fitted in that slot. Under Letizia Ruggeri's orders, the police stepped into action and set up a trap to get the final proof they needed. They set up a roadblock and pretended they were testing for drunk driving. They knew well this was the route their suspect took daily, so they were just expecting him to pass by. And they stopped him and took a sample through a breathalyzer test. In fact, they took it twice. They pretended it didn't work properly the first time, so they had 2 nibs to make sure they had a proper sample. And when they checked it in the lab against the original sample, it was a 100% match. They had Ignoto number 1. His name was Massimo Bossetti. He was a builder and lived in Mapello, where the tracker dogs had led the police investigation at the very beginning. He had a wife and 3 children, and he was 43 years old. And amazingly, the first test they had carried out on the sample found on Yara's underwear and leggings had been right in narrowing the suspect down to someone with very light, piercing eyes. The police showed up at Massimo Bossetti's workplace, a building site, on June 16, 2014. When he sees them coming, Massimo Bossetti runs. But of course, all exits are closed off and the police catch him and handcuff him. He is arrested and was later sentenced to life in jail, where he still is to this day. However, Massimo Bossetti still claims he is innocent, and his lawyers insist the DNA found on Yara was only a partial sample, that it was only mitochondrial DNA, that it's not proof because it could be someone else's DNA. I'm not sure how this works, but however, his DNA was found on Yara's underwear, and I think that is proof enough that he was her killer. His mother, Esther Arzuffi, also denies Massimo and his twin sister are not the children of her husband, Giovanni Bossetti. But the DNA test doesn't lie. So it also turned out that her 3rd son was also not the child of her husband, but yet of another man. So she had quite a few affairs, but she still denied it throughout her whole life. She said that these were the children of her husband, Giovanni Bossetti. And it is hard to imagine what it must have been like for these people, Massimo Bossetti's brother and sister, to find out at the same time that their brother was a killer, the killer of a child, and that the person they believed to be their father, the person who had raised them, was not their biological father after all. I still wonder to this day what exactly happened that night. My personal opinion is that Yara managed to fight off a sexual assault from Bossetti, who was very slight and short man, while she was a strong, fit athlete, and that he fled, that he left the scene. Sadly, her injuries, though, were too bad for her to be able to get up and walk out of that field to get help. I dedicate this painting to the memory of Yara Gambirasio. This is all from me for today. If you like this video, please do leave a like, as it helps out my channel. It helps it to get seen. And subscribe if you want to get notified of my next videos. Please hit the notification bell button. If you want to see all my artwork in one place, my handle on Instagram is drawings in a drawer, all in one word. Have a good day and see you soon.